Good evening. I'm Carol Dietrich, Dean of Libraries at the University of Kentucky. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the library's inaugural Distinguished Author Lecture. Over the decades, this great hall has been the scene of many important lectures on the University of Kentucky campus. Tonight, we're gathered to hear from one of the leading voices on American society and culture. The UK Libraries is proud to sponsor this event in cooperation with our many co-sponsors and donors who are listed in your program. These sponsors are a testament to the willingness of our campus community, in particular our colleges, schools, and departments, as well as the community, to work in partnership to provide this event at no charge to the public. Thank you for your support in making this event a reality. I'm delighted to see many of our students here as well, because one of the purposes of our program tonight was to inspire our students and our community, and also to enhance the intellectual life of our campus and our community. Dr. Tracy Campbell, Associate Professor of History here at the University of Kentucky, will introduce our speaker. Dr. Campbell specializes in the social and political history of the United States and is the author of 3 books. Most recently, and just published, one entitled Deliver the Vote, A History of Election Fraud, an American Political Tradition, 1742 to 2004. I think we may need to have Dr. Campbell as a speaker sometime. Dr. Campbell also serves as the co-director of the library's Wendell H. Ford Public Policy Research Center. Senator and Mrs. Ford are with us tonight, and I want to take this opportunity to recognize them and to thank them for helping to make the Ford Center a reality. The library's Ford Public Policy Research Center supports the study and debate of public policy issues at both the national and state level. The center also promotes research in the library's nationally recognized public policy archives. Dr. Campbell.
Thank you, Dean Dietrich. It is a special privilege for me to introduce tonight's speaker, who is really one of the legendary journalists and prolific authors of modern America. David Halberstam is a native New Yorker who in 1955 graduated with a degree in journalism from Harvard. And as the civil rights movement was beginning to take shape in the Deep South, he went to the source, starting his journalistic career in Mississippi with the Daily Times leader and then moving on to the Nashville Tennessean. He then went back to New York, where he joined the New York Times in 1960 and began covering a different kind of conflict in far-off Southeast Asia. Mr. Halberstam was one of the very first observers who understood the underlying flaws with American policy in Vietnam. In fact, President Kennedy asked the publisher of the New York Times, Arthur Sulzberger, if he could move the troubling young reporter to another bureau. "Isn't he too close to the story?" the president asked. Well, for being too close to the story, Mr. Halberstam received the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting at the ripe age of 30. To countless young reporters, he is an unrivaled figure. Mark Bowden, author of Black Hawk Down, probably said it best. He said he was the best war reporter of his generation. Mr. Halberstam chronicled America's missteps in Vietnam into a book called The Making of a Quagmire. And then another brilliant book whose very title is now part of our modern political language, The Best and the Brightest. And then he's gone on to tackle a wide range of subjects in a prolific writing career that's produced 14 bestsellers. Just to mention a few, a monumental work that described the rise of the modern media and the powers that be. Playing for Keeps, Michael Jordan and the World He Made. Mr. Halberstam, you should know this is probably the one locale on the planet where Michael Jordan is not highly regarded, nor any of his Tar Heel brethren. He's written several classic books on baseball, including The Summer of '49 and Teammates. He's also published a book on the tragic saga of Ladder 35 in Manhattan, which lost nearly all of its firefighters on 9/11. His most recent book that was just published concerns New England Patriots head football coach Bill Belichick and is titled The Education of a Coach. And as I understand it, he'll be signing copies of that tomorrow evening at Joseph Beth at 7 p.m. And so it's altogether fitting, considering the times in which we find ourselves, that Mr. Halberstam comes to us tonight to bring his vast experience to us to talk about America and the war, new challenges in an age of uncertainty. I should add that when he is finished, he has agreed to take questions. We ask that you come to one of the two microphones we have set up here, and we'll be taking those questions up through about 8 o'clock, and then I have to be timekeeper. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, won't you please join me in a warm welcome for one of the singular commentators of our time, Mr. David Halberstam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cameron, for the generous introduction, and thank you for having me here in Lexington. I wonder if we could scratch the Mark Bowden quote from it. It's a wonderful book that he wrote, Black Hawk Down. It's one of the best books of combat that I've ever seen, but I was not by any means the best combat reporter of Vietnam. I was an early pessimist. There were many other reporters who stayed longer. Peter Arnett, Charles Moore of my own paper, who I think saw more combat and did it with great, great skill. So the fear of being hit by a thunderbolt for someone else's exaggerated statement of what you've done sort of stays with me, a rare flash of modesty. A few years ago, just before the start of the millennium, I gave a series of lectures about where America was. And I thought the main forces changing it and challenging it. And the most important at that time, of course, was the end of the Cold War and a belief that much of the newly liberated energy from that terrible bipolar struggle that had gone on for so long, for most of my lifetime, so much of that energy and financial and military resource could be used for domestic purposes. I believe now that in that heady, indeed almost euphoric atmosphere, we all underestimated some of the new forces that would be in play, as so many forces that had been repressed on both sides of the Cold War were unleashed. The rise of both nationalism and, most dramatically in the former Yugoslavia, even tribalism throughout the world. I think Yugoslavia is the most dramatic example, a country degenerating into genocide, and a classic example of that. In the Middle East, the move of Saddam Hussein towards the Kuwaiti oil, Gulf War I, was something that probably wouldn't have been allowed when Iraq was a Soviet client state. I spoke in those lectures of any number of new domestic forces, the changes in my lifetime. When I was in college, there was for example, archaic era, a one-income American middle class. We were then rich because Europe had waged suicidal war on itself twice in 25 years. We were rich in a world that was poor, and we now have a two-income middle class with both parents working and having less and less time for children, people working harder and harder just to stay where they are in the middle class. I mentioned one of the most profound changes in my lifetime, the change in the nature of work. From work when I was a young man being driven by blue-collar muscularity to work being driven by education. Jobs, good jobs that do not demand muscle. Thus a workplace where a 115-pound young woman with a college degree is more valuable than a 200-pound former high school football star, who wants a job on the Ford or the GM line, except that those jobs are essentially gone. And the ever greater importance, therefore, of education in our society. And I mentioned that that change and other comparable or allied ones have had considerable impact on the rise of cultural rather than economic issues in our politics, because so many men today feel that they are not doing as well as their fathers and are not as influential at home as their fathers were in what now seems to be to them a simpler and better America. I don't think that the social, economic, and cultural, and even psychological impact of this change in work can be underestimated, and we're just beginning to touch it. In fact, it seems to me the major dilemma of the Democratic Party, which for a variety of reasons should be doing well economically with certain sectors of the nation, but can't because of the gender wariness on the part of men against it. I spoke about the coming of a new, non-white America, very different from that of my childhood in the 30s and 40s, and the great new influx of Hispanic Americans, not just in the South and Southwest, but throughout the country, and the political rise, once again, in many overt and covert forms of nativism. I spoke about what I thought was our greatest strength as a nation, in addition to our wonderful social fluidity. I think that's a great American treasure, the social fluidity, and that is our magnificent upper educational system, where not just the elite colleges and private schools of the East and Stanford, Chicago, but our great land-grant universities, the Big Ten, schools like this, California as the nation of California, Boston Route 128, the nation of Boston. This allows us to be resilient and regenerative and to stay on the cutting edge scientifically and economically, or at least it has so far. We are, in that sense, it seems to me, have been at least, a beacon to the rest of the world. We are not just an economic and military superpower, but most important of all, we have been an educational superpower, something that has allowed us to renew our strength and wealth again and again. And we do not, or at least we have not for so long, stood on past achievements. We celebrate, it seems to me, as no other society has, the ability to rise above the level attained by your parents in just one generation. We have, it seems to me, a remarkable capacity for renewal and regeneration. Part of that is the upper educational system, and part of it is the nature of our people and our immigration policies, which keeps us from being static. We are, as a people, I think, have been driven, ambitious, hardworking. We are, on occasion, we make our friends nervous with our energy and our sharp elbows. Harold Macmillan, the then future Prime Minister of England, told a colleague in 1943, when the torch was being passed to the Americans and Ike was trying to deal with Bernard Law of Montgomery, he said, "We are the Greeks in the American Empire. You will find the Americans much as the Greeks found the Romans, great, big, vulgar, bustling people, more vigorous than we." I hope we retain that vigor. But I mentioned in those lectures as well our weakness in K through 12, what seems to me to be increasingly our national shame, that I felt in all too many venues we were slipping, and that we were losing far too many kids at too young an age, American kids, and that this was undemocratic, a phrase I never thought I'd use, un-American, and that there was a rot in much of our essential educational foundation. when I think about the gap in education at this elemental level between what my own daughter, the children of most of you, are privileged to enjoy and what so many other far less fortunate American children face, I am reminded of one of John Kennedy's best sentences. If we cannot help the many who are poor, how can we save the few who are rich? And that brings up the question of whether we are reinvesting in our children, truly reinvesting in the most elementary way in their education, as we once did when I was young, and whether not only are becoming an older society with too little in the way of replacement and too little in the way of energy, a society that threatens to have too great a dividing line between it, between haves and have-nots, and that line being drawn in educational terms. We cannot be a superpower or a hypopower. I always get confused by hypo and hydro. My wife has to remind me that hydro probably means we have a lot of water. We cannot be a great, great power of 300 million people if we are only taking care of a small elite that has a capacity to replenish itself. If someone came up today with a bill comparable to the GI Bill, which I believe, along with the land-grant colleges, is the greatest investment we've ever made in ourselves. I mean, in terms of strength and muscularity and optimism, a new kind of GI Bill where you traded off not necessarily military service, but some kind of public service for time and education and maybe even housing loans. I wonder if it could be passed. Or would someone be afraid of a spot used against him or her in an election campaign, charging once more that that candidate had tried to raise taxes too often? I'm mentioned in those lectures, one of the great surprises to me in America today was the change in the nature of exports. From exporting cars and other manufactured goods, we now export to the rest of the world, for better or for worse, our popular culture. And I mentioned the change wrought by technology from the blue-collar, rather Calvinist society to, because of a rush of inventions and communications, becoming a communication society for time, and finally, an entertainment society, from embryonic television to ever larger screens, in color, satellite, instead of 4 or 5 channels, 400 or 500, in effect, a giant theater in our own homes. And the effect that has on us, and whether we expect to be entertained instantly every night, and what that does, and whether that collides with the purpose of citizenship. You know, and we're living in a society where the greatest sin, if you are running one of the networks, is not to get something wrong or to be in bad taste, but to be boring. And does that change our values and how much we are both addicted to it and on occasion resentful of it as well? And in how in so many ways, some good, some bad, changes who we are. We might, however, ponder the increasing difficulty of making complicated political decisions, especially about the future, in a society that increasingly wants, more than anything else, to be entertained. And our attention span becomes ever briefer and shorter. If you go around and only quote people in sound bites, pretty soon they will only think in sound bites. And finally, I mentioned a world of Islam aflame, angry over its fall centuries ago from greatness, now explosive and dangerous, feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L, in many ways, but with access to the most modern instruments of communications with which to fan its own feelings. And that, by the way, of itself is a terrifying combination, a feudal society with modern communications, feeling of grievance. I suggested that a critical part of our policy towards that part of the world was that we not become its lightning rod, not the lightning rod for their anger, so much of it ill-defined and poorly focused. I did not in those speeches mention terrorism, and like everyone else, I was behind the curve. That then came September 11th. We should obviously, all of us, seen something like that on the horizon. And then came the invasion of Iraq. About a year and a half ago, the people who run the Kennedy Library in Boston asked me to come up and do a full lecture on Iraq and Vietnam. I had been critical of Iraq for some time, and I held them off for several weeks because I just, in a way, didn't want to go there to do it, to open that door again. My life and my work go well these days. I'm finishing a book, which will be my 21st, comes out maybe a year from now, that I care deeply about. It's a book that Vietnam led me to. It's the moment in the Korean War when the Chinese crossed the Yalu and caught us unaware. Douglas MacArthur had told the President of the United States they would not come in, but a mere 300,000 of them snuck across, another intelligence failure. So I did not want to enter another ugly battle like the one that I and some of my colleagues went through back in the 60s over Vietnam when I was a young reporter for the Times, filing pessimistic dispatches and learning on the fly. And two presidents, Mr. Campbell mentioned John Kennedy, but Lyndon Johnson took time out from his very difficult, demanding duties as President of the United States to double as a minister of truth and patriotism, and he said that my young colleague Neil Sheehan and I were traitors to our country. Time magazine had run two vicious pieces trying to destroy my career and that of my colleagues. It was not fun. It's not fun to have your manhood, your patriotism, all that stuff attacked, particularly when you're young. Generally, things have come full circle. John McCain has written an introduction to a new version of the Best and the Brightest, which is a very nice thing for me, a feeling that it is all back together. So I didn't really want to go up to the Kennedy Library and do it, but I did because I think it's important to talk as candidly as we can about Iraq, to try and give, if you are a Vietnam guy, some historical perspective. In fact, and also because as things began to go more obviously south in Vietnam, I started coming up on the Rolodexes of the bookers of TV shows in Washington and New York, as I had not come up when we were first crossing the Rubicon there. And I should point out that I'm not a Middle East person, but I am tempered by my experiences of working throughout the Third World in Africa and Asia. And what I got in Vietnam was much more than a prize and a book or two. I got an education, as did all my colleagues. A bitter one. We had to be re-educated. All the things that we had believed in when we first got there in 62 and 63 and 64 proved to be invalid. The Cold War as we had known it and studied as young men under the aegis of teachers such as Bundy and Brzezinski and Kissinger and other names that have now become quite familiar. That sense of what divided the West and the communists in Europe proved utterly unreliable and in fact a reverse of what was happening where the past was colonial. About a year and a half ago, I did a long piece for Vanity Fair. It came out in the middle of the Swift boat controversy, and it was about Senator Kerry and President Bush. And it's not my job to be partisan, but what I said was that Kerry was not more courageous and he was not more patriotic, but what he had was a much better education. And all of us who had that education, who went there, particularly when we were young, with one kind of dream, came back profoundly changed and wiser. And I remember, in fact, recently, a couple months ago, there was a Nightline show, and there was some Marine captain who got up and said, talking about Iraq, that if we pulled out now, we would be scorning and mocking and betraying those who had already died. And I thought, history surely does repeat itself, because I had heard that same argument and had been moved by it then, as I am not moved by it now, in 1963, when the number of Americans who died in Vietnam was in double digits. So I am not moved by that one. And so are Iraq and Vietnam the same? And the answer is yes and no. One was a colonial war, in the embers of a colonial war. One was in Asia, one is in the Middle East. One is more complicated because it's not just colonial, it's religious, and it's a country that is not necessarily a country. But there are great parallels, and the parallels come together in a great red flag that goes up if you had been in Vietnam. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I said right before the invasion, because I don't want you to think that these are ex post facto things or that I am a flip-flopper. The first thing I said was that we were about to punch our fist into the largest hornet's nest in the world, and that the consequences would be very different from what we expected, that the people there might not like their government. They might even hate Saddam Hussein, but for a variety of powerful historical forces, we would not be welcomed as liberators, especially if we did for them what they were supposed to do for themselves. But that we ought to be very careful about what all those forces were and whether we had any connection to them. I thought it was, given the already major commitment to the war on terrorism, a sidetrack, draining of limited resource, likely to separate us from our allies and potential friends in the area. It was, given the complexity of our relationships in the Middle East, the exact opposite, I thought, of what we need to be: wise and patient and strong. Wise and patient particularly. Strong comes more easily these days to us than wisdom and patience. We would, I thought, be doing the assorted terrorists in the area a favor, moving targets for them, going to their home area, stretching us thin instead of them. I did not think we had made the case of weapons of mass destruction, nor come anywhere close to proving that Iraq was a primary supporter of Osama bin Laden, the one so theocratic, the other so secular. I thought that our leadership had gravely underestimated the capacity of what would be the other side to resist once the first military phase was over. We would, I thought, with our great, brilliant military technology, do that quite well. The race to Baghdad. I'm one of the people who thought, in fact, that it was quite okay to have embedded reporters if you were going to do this. There was no other way to cover it. I thought the administration would love having the embedded reporters in the first part, and the liberal critics would hate it, and that once they got to Baghdad, it would switch, and that has pretty much happened. The second part would be about urban guerrilla warfare in terrain more favorable to them, their territory, their timetable. I feared their ability to nick away at our kids 2 or 3 a day. I thought we were utterly ill prepared for it, and that was likely to be stage 2. I think I was quite wrong here. I underestimated how quickly they could bring the level of violence. I was thinking of Vietnam drove me, when I came out, to learn not just about this Chinese coming in Korea, but a lot about the Algerian War. I used that as a model, and I underestimated what modern technology, both in communications and in weaponry, could do. It's happened much faster with far greater violence. I feared that in an urban guerrilla war, we would be in a very dangerous, indeed tragic, deficit intelligence situation. They would, for obvious reasons, know where we were at all time, identified by our uniforms and our skins, their racial profiling, while we did not know who they were. This would put our young servicemen and women under unbearable pressure in situations that were really beyond dangerous. I still feel that way. I sort of have such pain when I think of young men and women having to go there in what seems to me to be kind of hopeless situation. The movie they were watching in the White House, it seemed to me, and I suggested, was Patton, and the movie they should have been watching was The Battle of Algiers, the brilliant Gilles de Pontecorvo movie, which I commend to anyone here who hasn't seen it, which is about the Algerian rebels waging urban guerrilla warfare against the French. By the way, about a month or two into the war, they started showing it in the Pentagon. I also was wary, who was a child of the World War II generation, of a change and going to a preemptive invasion. And that's a side issue and a side lecture. The great intelligence failure, I believed, and believe to this day, was not the weapons of mass destruction one. I think you can almost understand that one, although I think that Saddam's buildup was always aimed at Iran rather than at what we think of as us. But that the great mistake was that the idea that we would be treated as liberators, a fatal mistake. And you can see now that our young men and women have been under attack from the very forces we were supposed to have liberated. How the intelligence community failed to send up more in the way of red flags. How the head of the CIA could say that it was a slam dunk. How can we spend billions and billions on intelligence and get something so basic so wrong? I mean, that's a great, great issue. I know that this is a more difficult time to make foreign policy decisions. I know that it's not like the easier days of the Cold War when there was that polar division. But this is a time that calls for wisdom. One of the most lasting, historically perhaps the most lasting aspect of this war may be the fact that for the first time, the Arab world is getting its news on an Arab news channel, live and in color, with Arab commentators, watching white Christian soldiers fighting against Arabs. Now, the administration is very angry about this. It doesn't think that Al Jazeera plays fair. But whoever thought they would? Whoever, I mean, you can send Karen Hughes there and you can send her there again, but if you have ever worked in the underdeveloped world with all the burdens of history, cultural, from colonial, from religion, do not expect that that's going to be a fair break. What we are doing is doing their recruiting for them. And it is a devastating thing, and it may well be the most lasting aspect of this war. I should add that the doubts that I had and so many like me who had been in Vietnam were shared by many senior officers in the uniformed military who had spent time in Vietnam. They were wary about the use of power in a situation like that. fearing the moment, as in Vietnam, when your military superiority is neutralized or negated by your political vulnerability. There was one member of that administration who, at the high level, had served in Vietnam, former general and then Secretary of State Colin Powell, and these men, the Vice President had 5 deferments, the Attorney General had 6. All these men who hadn't served, they thought he was a wimp. They thought he was a wimp. I mean, he had gone, they hadn't, but they thought he was soft. Tony Zinni, 3-star Marine, CENTCOM commander, sat, I think it's in 2003, when the Vice President of the United States spoke to the American Legion, and he was trying to stop what Brent Scowcroft, the trusted national security aide to the first George Bush, had put in play when Scowcroft had, in effect, spoken very negatively about doing this. Scowcroft is, I think, a very admirable, thoughtful man. And in order to stop Scowcroftism, the Vice President said that they had hard intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. And Tony Zinni, multiple tours of Vietnam, ribbons from about here to here, and he's spoken very publicly, said, that man is a liar. I was the head of CENTCOM. I was, more than anything else, interested in that, and there was never proof of it. So I think the uniformed military had much the same pessimistic view of it. I am deeply saddened by this tragic miscalculation, using our power and our force where it seems to me it is being misapplied. I believe it has made the real job of trying to deal with Al-Qaeda and parallel terrorist groups infinitely more difficult. I think we are more isolated from allies. Our attention has pulled from terrorism to this war, which does not, I think, work. We are becoming a lightning rod, as I had feared, for all kinds of other grievances. I think in all ways it places us in what we don't want, more likely to be in an ongoing confrontation with young, angry protesters from the Islamic world, and placing our allies in a situation where there's less and less middle ground. I don't like, at this moment in our life, when I think the country is in many ways, different other ways, vulnerable, being critical. I don't like, as someone who went through this in Vietnam, having to talk like this again. I have a feeling that we all went through it and did it, and it's as if we didn't learn it. This is obviously much harder than Vietnam. The Vietnamese only wanted us to go home. They were willing to strew flowers along our path. There hasn't been much Vietnamese terrorism to us. This is different. There's a real enemy out there. And some of us will follow us home, or at least try to. Any weakness will encourage them. I spoke recently. I got inducted into Phi Beta Kappa recently at Harvard. It took 50 years. I have ADD, so when I graduated, I was in the bottom half of my class. And it wasn't by chance that I took a job on the smallest daily in Mississippi. Who else would have me? And I was working on the Belichick book in the spring, and I called in, and my wife, I said, are there any messages? And my wife, I could hear her laughing over the phone, said, yes, call Professor Everett Mendelsohn at Harvard. Well, if you went to Harvard, as I do you take any call from Harvard very warily, because they either want money or a free lecture. I mean, one or the other. I mean, there's no upside. So I said nervously, what does he want? And she said, to tell you, you've been elected to honorary Phi Beta Kappa. So the graduating class, 5/8 are allowed to invite 2 people in, and I was one of them. That's very nice. It takes a long time to get smart. The point of this story is not about me being in Phi Beta Kappa, but that the lecture that day was given by John Deutsch, former head of the CIA and former number 2 in the Defense Department, a very hard, unsentimental man who said, it doesn't work, it isn't going to work, getting out is going to be painful, but staying on isn't going to make it better, and it's just going to prolong the agony at the expense of someone else's children. I thought, John Deutsch. I mean, he's harder line than anybody I'd heard talking. There's a sense here, I've always been an American optimist. I've always believed in a sense of civic virtue. And I don't think these are good days for a broader sense of civic virtue. I want to go back from Iraq to where we are, because I think Iraq pulls us from what we should really be thinking about. I've always believed in an America that is resilient, reborn, with great sense that we would have, that we all ought to get on board, that there ought to be a place for all of us, that our children ought to have an equal voyage. And for the first time, I'm worried. There are some things out there that make me feel that if we do not right ourselves, these are signs of a society that is turned away from the future. One is so many states where the only way the state government can tax is through gambling casinos. Not a good sign. The willingness of so many sophisticated and educated people of the upper middle class, who I see so often back east, who would not let their own children go to Iraq, but are willing to let the children of the poor go. And a society that offers to young Hispanic immigrants in the LA area a chance to get your green card a little quicker if you go in the military and go to Iraq. A failure to discipline ourselves and tax ourselves properly on oil. And so it becomes a serious national security issue. Pouring money, because we won't tax ourselves, into the coffers of those who wish us badly. Reminds me as if Franklin Roosevelt on December 8, 1948, had declared war on the Japanese and then gave a speech on December 9th saying we would continue to supply them with rubber and oil and steel. I'm just staggered that that opportunity was blown. The rise of a certain kind of fundamentalism, not just politically, but in a shocking concurrent part of it, a shocking assault on modern contemporary science. I mean, that's not just me talking, that's people like Bill Gates and Andy Grove, who said this one night on Charlie Rose, gave, I thought, the most pessimistic and melancholy estimate of where America was, particularly because we are no longer alone. We have a challenge from the Chinese and the Indians and many others. We're going to work hard, save more, and work hard on their education. We are not alone, and we have been wasteful, and we are being careless with education as they are not. The getting rid of almost all foreign correspondence on network news shows and eviscerating the most important of the nightly news special shows that we had, just when we need it most, Nightline, evisceration, make it a more entertaining show. Goodbye, Ted Koppel. As if we now live in a journalistic fortress America. I mean, what is going on in France is a very big story. It is not just a very big American story. It is a very big French story. it is a big European story, and it is a big American story. Something very powerful and profound is at play there, and it has consequences for every developed country, and we are, with our main channels of communication, paying very little attention. What kind of a society are we then? What do we reward? New York Magazine annually does an issue on what people make. Billion for some people on Wall Street, billion a year. 100 million for somebody in advertising, manipulating our taste. 50 million there for one lawyer. 12 million for an anchor man. None of it money that could have gone to foreign reporters, and the anchor men took it instead. I'm not getting on terribly well with the anchor men these days. 150,000 for doctor, not a lot in New York. 30,000 for teacher, one of them is my daughter, and 30,000 for nurse. So what does that tell us about ourselves? People like Bill Gates and Andy Grove, as I say, have warned us that people are moving past us in science and education. And that has always been, as I said earlier, what kept us regenerative. So these are serious challenges, and the choices are ours. And I'm not sure, for the first time in my life, we're even pondering. So I'm not a pessimist, but for the first time in my adult life, I have doubts. I have doubts because it's not just that the questions are out there. I don't see us debating them. I don't see anybody talking about it. Maybe you can't do the debate anymore because you're down to sound bites. And so in the sound bite, the loudest voice is that it would cost money, and whoever's for it wants to tax you again. Anyway, thank you very much for having me here tonight.
We have two microphones set up here right at the end of these aisles, and we hope now that we have a rare chance to ask questions of Mr. Halberstam. If you would, please. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hi. Great to be here. I appreciate
Thank you.
What you had to share. What can we do about the chatter class in the media?
The chatter class.
The chatter class.
What is the chatter class?
The chatter class are those 20 or 30 people who seem to be monopolizing so much of the discussion on the cable channels during primetime hours. What can we do to be able to broaden that? When you talk about the fact that there isn't
my friend Bud Trillin calls them the Sabbath gas bags. I think it's, I don't know, I mean, it's, in an odd way, it's more democratized. I mean, the cable has democratized it, but the problem is that you get more heat than light. I mean, the cable, one of the things, it's a very interesting thing about the democratization of the media as you've done it, as you've gone from more channels, you go to a lower level of serious talk because every cable channel is fighting for half point. If they get a half point, a scandal, O.J. Simpson, that, brings them up, and they are, instead of being poor, they have a very good year. They loved the Lewinsky Clinton thing, which when I was a young man would not have been a story. I mean, maybe those rules were wrong, but they glom on to sensation and celebrity. And if you go in the green room where you're waiting to go on one of these shows, and it's very alien for someone of my generation, the assistant director, producer comes in and says, Bill or Bob or whoever it is really likes it if you mix it up. You know, in other words, the angrier you are, the more you make ridiculous assessments, the better television it is. So I don't know what you can do. I mean, it is the technology. It's, you know, it's out of the bag, and it has a dynamic of its own, and it's very hard to reverse that. I thought the cutting back of Nightline, I mean, that was an awfully important show in our family. I mean, it was the only page, too. Koppel did it well. It's very hard to interview live on television. He did it, and you could really find things out. And they think that we who watched it are old, geriatric, they're right, and that what they want is younger people who are going to spend more money over a longer period of time. I think they're wrong. I would have faith going back to the intelligence of the American people, that the more you do it and the better you do it, people will hear you, and that you can keep a society tuned with shows, not shows that reach 30 million, but if you do the right thing in the right way, you know, a couple million people can make a great difference. But I'm on the wrong side, and I'm not going to be the head of CBS News or NBC News. The answer is, I don't know. There's a lot of information out there. There's more sources than ever. The problem is, a lot of the stuff on the internet, it's very democratic, the internet. Everyone, his or her own reporter and his or her own editor. But there's no verification process. And while there's often brilliance, it tends to be extremely idiosyncratic. And being a reporter, a good one, takes a lot of time, a lot of, you know, learning. And what you're really finally selling more than anything else is judgment. And I don't see the internet as necessarily being full of that. So the technology, I talked about my 50th reunion. I went back there, and there were about 6 or 7 of us who'd gone into journalism. We went on a panel. We were allowed about 6 minutes each. And all of us were really, in a way, somewhat melancholy, because it's not, I mean, it's coming downward. The technology is changing underneath us, and very quickly. First there was television, the networks, then there was cable, and now there's the internet. And traditional news sources, the kind of things that I believed in, like papers like the New York Times, are, you know, really vulnerable. As the technology changes, the economics change. And we were sort of, I would say, a bit pessimistic. I believe there is a great need to know. I don't know what will replace a paper like the Washington Post or the LA Times or the New York Times as if they do recede into history. The need to know, to think, to be informed in a free society is very profound, and I would presume that something will replace them. That you know, what the form will be, I don't know. But right now, tough time, very tough time in our business. And the economic underpinnings are very weak.
Do you have any insight or explanation for the Tony Blair acceptance of the American position on Iraq?
The question is about Tony Blair on it. Here's what I think happened. I think Blair had been, if you recall, very close to Clinton. I think when the election was over, he conferred very privately with Clinton. I mean, I do not have this by evidence. It's not that someone who knew Clinton told me, but I'm almost sure I'm right. And Clinton said, if you want to deal with this president, you have to be for him 100%, very publicly, otherwise you will be frozen out. He will not take criticism from you, and he will not take a cool standing back. You're going to have to be very publicly aligned and very supportive. And if you do that, you may have some influence. I think what Blair, I'm sure what he thought on, I'm sure he was, like many people, shocked by 9/11 and spoke eloquently of it, spoke more eloquently than our own leadership. I think, and that's a natural, I think if you are British, you have so much invested in us right now in terms of spiritual, military, economic things. I think what he thought he was getting, I think so many people thought they were getting one thing from this administration and didn't get it. I would list General Powell as one of those. I think he thought he was getting a chance to be the go-between between Washington and Europe, and that if he did this and supported, he would have influence with the president and particularly might be able to affect our policies on Israel and the Palestinians. And I think he thought that was the quid pro quo, and I think he's probably had, I think Clinton was right, all the way in or all the way out. You can't be 85%. And that he ended up with less leverage than he thought he was going to get. That is my supposition, but I bet I'm right. I just have a great instinct that I'm right. At both levels, that was what Clinton told him. Because Clinton, he were very close, and he made the 180-degree shift. And I think it explains why he did it, and I don't think he got back as much as he thought he was getting in the bargain. Is it your turn? Oh, yes.
Your excellent book on Vietnam, you entitled The Best and the Brightest. If you were to write a book on Iraq, would you be forced to entitle it The Worst and the Dumbest?
No, because they're not dumb. They're very ideological. And they have in their minds a world that never was and never is. And they see, they're not dumb. Cheney's brilliant at working inside the bureaucracy. He's very good at it. Wolfowitz is certainly smart enough. It's about narrowness. It's about failure to live in other people's countries. It's about thinking that the people who did Vietnam did not apply enough power, that we were wimps. I'd be very surprised, for example, if the president has read really any serious Vietnam books. He has said famously that, Vietnam, that was a war where the president didn't let the military do what it wanted to do. This from a president who forced Rick Shinseki out because he wanted to send about 400,000 men if they were going to do Iraq too. They really used, what's his name, Tommy Franks, pretty much as a messenger boy to keep that total down. I don't think they're stupid. I think they're narrow. I think they're ideological. I think they did not understand what had happened in Vietnam. I think they didn't understand the limits of power if the politics and the power are not aligned, what I call the sort of tipping point. In Vietnam, we had absolute military superiority. We could really win any set-piece battle. And then the other side had absolute political superiority, which meant they could, keep recruiting and keep coming down the trails and replenishing. I don't know these figures anymore. I used to think I knew them. I think 300,000 young men came into the North Vietnamese draft age each year. If we figure 10 to 1, we were losing roughly 10,000. We were probably, maybe really were killing 100,000. It's quite possible. We used a lot of firepower. We used twice, it's a little Asian nation, we used twice the bombing that we did in all of World War II. It was a lot of firepower. I would not be surprised by a 10 to 1 ratio, which is 100,000 people. That means we're taxing them. We never understood that they controlled the rate of the war. They could bring it up, raise it, bring it up, down. I don't think the people who were the architects of this were short on their history, high on their hubris, believed that power, military power as an end in itself, had more validity in the world we lived in than it does. I think they are American naïfs who think they're tough guys. They think people like me are wimps, and they're probably right. I mean, I am something of a. I think we all are wimps. Anybody that you'd like is probably a bit of a wimp. I think the president misread what happened to his father in '92. I think he thought that his father had been weak, which was not true. And that he lost the election in '92 because he hadn't. I think they thought that getting Saddam was a kind of crusade, to use a word that occasionally comes from the president's mouth. I think they're wrong. I think they just did not understand the forces at play in the world and the limits of our power, even though that power is awesome. I mean, the kind of thing that we did when we were getting Milosevic to get out of town. I mean, the technology to sit here and decide to take out X apartment in X building, in effect in New York, and hit almost that and nothing else. I mean, it's awesome what we really can do with the new technology, but it doesn't affect the human heart and the human mind and all that anger, and they got that wrong, and it was really because they didn't do their homework. In the past, and I'll go on a little, I'll digress a bit more. In the years after Vietnam, there was an alliance when the big boys went to the poker table to decide whether or not to go. And the alliance in those years, oddly enough, was, the foot on the brake was the United States Army and the State Department, who were most affected by Vietnam. Air Force, Navy were more on the periphery. The Army, probably the Marines, were a little wary too, as I mentioned, Tony Zinni. I mean, they were the people who paid the higher price. And the State Department had sources. When we got to Bush II, it was very interesting, and I think General Powell didn't realize it. The game had shrunk. They took the Army out of it. I mean, if you read Bob Woodward's book, they used Tommy Franks. I mean, Rumsfeld keeps sending him back, come back with a smaller figure. The Army is not a player. Tommy Franks is not allowed to sit there, as Colin Powell was able to sit at the table with Bush I and say, I want 500,000 to 600,000. A moment in Bush I where I think they're at around 600,000, and George H.W. Bush says, Colin, is that enough for you now? I mean, Tommy Franks never had that leverage. So you're pulling back a key ally of the Doves, and you're adding a powerful new player, the office of the Vice President of the United States, who has his own people, very influential and very ideological, at high levels throughout the government. So that it was a very different poker game, and I don't think Colin Powell knew how different the game was until it was a little too late. Yes?
It's a great privilege. I read Summer 49 as a kid, and it's a great privilege to speak to you tonight.
I can barely hear you, and
it's a great privilege to speak to you tonight. I read Summer 49 as a kid. I'm just wondering if this next century is not going to be an American one, if that is true, and if we're going to become analogous to China or India, so far as we can, as Great Britain is to us. As someone who's not going to witness that, how does that make you feel, and then what thoughts do you have on that, and possibly, to make it more concise, where would you first expect to see that take place?
I'm always a little nervous by the phrase, the American century. I thought that was hubristic. I mean, I think we were an extraordinary power, and a variety of things worked for us, not the least of which the self-inflicted wounds of Europe. And I think there is a kind of American energy that we symbolized in the second part of middle and second part of the 20th century, a sense of possibilities, of freedom and expansiveness and getting beyond class and these great universities. And I think in the peace we made after World War II was generally a generous one. I think we began to trip ourselves up. I think there's room, plenty of room, for us to be influential and powerful and optimistic in the rest of the century. I think we do a lot of things well. We have the universities. We have a wonderfully diverse body politic. I think our ethnic diversity is a great strength. I think our freedoms are a great strength. We never know. And the Soviets, in the old days, when you suppress an idea, and you suppress a person, you don't know whose talent you're stomping out. I always thought our openness was a great source of thing. One of the things that worries me about the terrorism is that I fear that we will, if we have too many terrorist incidents, we will move away from being a freer society. I think we can, if we are true to what is our best, if we are wise, if we think of what makes a strong society, we can do just fine. We don't have to be an American century. It may not be a Chinese century. They're doing very well because they're on a high curve, but they're at a high curve from a very low starting point. Japanese, I remember writing a book about the Japanese challenge to us, and when the Japanese started out, they did very, very well. They fell a bit apart because their educational system at the higher level was about memorization. A friend of mine there who was the head of MITI, brilliant man, and here were the Japanese, nobody worked hard in the Japanese students. And you go to one of their great universities, Todai, for 4 years, and everything you knew could be replicated, he said, by a computer. We were teaching people to be analytical. We were much more likely to produce a Bill Gates than they were. I mean, I think if we're true to ourselves and our own strengths, we can be just fine. But we do need civic virtue, and we do need to know that it isn't good enough just for us to make it ourselves, me, me, me. We have to think of a broader politic, that if it's good for the broader society, we've fallen away from that, I think. I think we've become, for a variety of reasons, taxes, whatever, we've become more selfish than we used to be. When I grew up in those years, immediately after World War II, when there was the society was on a kind of rise and a great middle class ascent and the GI Bill kicking. I think so, a lot of things that the government did. I mean, government became a bad word starting in the Reagan years. But the marriage of government to the private sector, which really has great, great roots in the GI Bill, that's a good marriage. And I mean, there are things the government can do or the government can encourage that the private sector on its own can't do everything and may give you, in fact, unchecked, more of Enron.
We have time for probably one more question.
Hello.
I was just wondering, over and over I hear, stop the war, and I find I'm saying it myself, yet I have not heard a solution to this. And will it take a draft to bring people out and to actually stand against this?
The answer is I don't know. I think it doesn't work. I think the due line or the litmus test will be in the Republican Party, in some of the congressional elections. They're the people whose feet are closest to the fire. I think there's significant signs out there that it is now becoming a political issue, as it wasn't a year ago. And as I was saying to Professor Herring earlier, that the administration poured a great deal of its credibility in trying to suppress criticism into the 2004 political election so that it's used up a lot of its power. I don't really know the answer, but I think when something doesn't work, this is not a very ideological country. It's an administration for a variety of reasons that's more ideological than the country. The country has always had, in my lifetime, I hope it's still true, an essential centrist pragmatism. I think that's being violated right now in this, and I think there's a common sense factor in the country that I hope will raise its head. I would think the election, if things continue the way they are, in the off year, it would be very interesting to see where the president is welcome and where he is not welcome. Thank you all very much for having me here tonight.